Until the late 1960s, the medical community believed that autism was caused by bad mothering. Today, most people and most of the medical community believes that autism is a genetic brain disorder. I'm here to tell you that neither one of these statements is true. Think about it. Rates of autism have skyrocketed over the years. Now, 1 in 68 United States kids has an autism spectrum disorder. Sure, wider criteria for diagnosis and better detection might explain some of it, but not an increase of this magnitude. The real reason we are seeing an increasing rate of autism is simply because autism is a systemic body disorder that affects the brain and the body. A toxic environment triggers certain genes in people susceptible to autism. Researchers have been searching for the one autism gene, or the one location in the brain that is damaged that leads to autism. Looking for these kinds of answers implies that the changes which cause autism or other brain disorders are genetically hardwired and therefore treatment is hopeless. But these researchers are looking in the wrong place for the source of the problem.
Autism has been misunderstood from the time that it was first described in the 1940s until now. It's really been misunderstood. It's thought to be primarily psychological, and in some parts of the world still thought to be psychological, not neurological. And so we've come a really long way. We know that it's not due to bad parenting, refrigerator mothers. We know that's not the case. We know that's not static. We know that it has a lot to do with the body's biochemistry, which is impacted by the environment. We know that it has to do with the brain's metabolism, and that a lot of that can be influenced and changed.
I see autism as what can be called an emergent property. So underneath the behaviors, and autism is defined purely behaviorally, underneath that there are things that are going awry. And what you see on the surface, like the bubbles on top of the waves in the ocean, is the behaviors. They are not things. They're the way the brain acts when it has certain kinds of stressors. There are so many different underlying genes, just in the ones which are associated with syndromes in autism, there are like well over 100 different genes, and the mechanisms don't overlap. So what I think of as the behaviors that emerge in autism or in other psychiatric conditions are common pathways in the way the brain acts that you can get at through many different genetic and molecular and systems challenges. It feeds out through the brain waves in certain channels that create behaviors that a psychologist can classify. But the way you get there is a many to few relationship, many different kinds of causal things to many fewer kinds of behaviors. So that's why we can label it, but it doesn't help us to understand how it was caused or what we can do about reducing the severity, or even people can recover from some of these conditions. And if you understand it this way, you understand that we can go in many places and help a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit somewhere else, and that adds up to something where the brain system gets some relief and can organize itself with a fuller set of flexible options.
We must ask ourselves, why do 95 to 100% of autistic children have gastrointestinal dysfunction, or 70% of them have immune system abnormalities? Experts who have studied autism spectrum disorders and work with autistic patients have seen time after time that these patients suffer from allergies, toxic exposures, infections, and nutritional deficiencies. But where do problems like these come from, and how do they affect the brain? And are they in the brain to begin with? It has long been known that children with autism not only have misfiring and wiring of their brain, but that 95% of autistic children have gastrointestinal problems and swollen bellies. It has also been noted that autistic children have frequent infections and allergies and have often had multiple courses of antibiotics. You know, I do recall a number of my patients who had the same story. One little girl was a beautiful little girl, but was like 9 years old and was violent. And she would attack her sister. She would get kicked out of class 10 times a day. She was on the bus home from school. They'd have to stop the bus. And she would like cut her, family out of pictures that she was in. It was just really powerful. And she didn't have any gut symptoms. And I found that she had terrible overgrowth of yeast, terrible bacterial overgrowth, like you mentioned. And I treated her gut, and she was sweet and loving and kind, never disrupted school anymore, could run on the bus home. And how many of these kids are struggling like this that really we can impact through these doorways to the brain?
I think you raised a great point that all parents should be aware of, which is when the problems in the gut don't always cause obvious gut symptoms. So that's tricky because when a parent sees the behavioral problems, or the doctor for that matter, they don't think about the gut automatically. They don't think this could be a gut issue. So that's the message that we need to get out there.
They just think it's some troubled kid or some bad kid.
I mean, consider the effect on the kid. The kid spend their whole life thinking there's something wrong with them. They're bad. They don't fit in. And there's some fundamental defect, which is just horrible for the child's development and self-esteem. But when they understand that there's actually something physiologically that's contributing to this and causing this, it doesn't just improve their symptoms. It totally shifts their awareness, their self-awareness, their self-concept, and can really dramatically change the outcome of their life for that reason.
Most doctors assume that these are annoying but secondary problems, meaning they have nothing to do with why autistic children's brains are not working properly or why their brains are swollen and inflamed. But many experts believe that the opposite is true.
As I came more and more to think of autism as a whole body condition that arises from environmental, nutritional, stress-related conditions, I realized that that's what's going on with everything else too. So that it's better for us to look at it in the context of an epidemic of chronic illness more generally. And even in autism, there are so many medical conditions. And it's not like they have these separate diagnoses. Here's the autism, and here's the epilepsy, and here's the irritable bowel syndrome, and here's the rashes. These are all emanations of some kind of underlying set of imbalances. And that's true across the board. So let's look at the underlying imbalances and where they come from and what we can do about it. When people talk about the brain in academia, on television, you get a picture of neurons in space. They're firing signals at each other, and they're just suspended in space. Actually, in the brain, the neurons are outnumbered by glial cells from 4-to-1 to 10-to-1 in different parts of the brain. And glial cells do so much of the metabolic work that keeps the brain alive. And then there are fluids and flows and all kinds of things. The brain is a living, wet organ.
We don't treat autism. I don't treat Alzheimer's. I treat humans who have bodies that are out of balance. And that strategy works to help reverse this brain dysfunction. 95% of autistic kids have gut dysfunction.
Yes, and maybe more.
Right, maybe more. Maybe all.
It's hard to imagine that they wouldn't, given how the abnormal brain development affects the gut and how the gut, so the bidirectionality of that. I think a basic way to think about the mechanism by which the gut is impacting the brain in autism is that when there is gut inflammation, it impacts the integrity of the intestinal lining, and so things enter into the systemic circulation that stimulate inflammation and inflammation in the brain as well. And we know that there's microglial activation. We know that there's a degree of
In other words, the brains of autistic kids are inflamed.
Right.
These gut, immune, and toxicity problems are integrally related to and often the cause of what happens in the brain. The brain and body function as a whole system, and multiple chronic triggers can throw the brain into chaos. So is autism a brain disorder or a systemic disorder that affects the brain?
With autism, I think we look at it as a neurologic or a brain disorder. And for me, autism is a brain disorder that happens downstream from several other medical problems. Kids with autism often have immune problems, they have gut problems, they have metabolic problems, and those are being missed because we say this child has autism. But if we look at the underlying mineral deficiencies or their dietary problems or their gut problems, we can actually help them to be not just more available for their therapy, but possibly recover. There's a great saying, genetics loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. Autism is a genetic susceptibility, but we have to look at all the environmental factors that may be affecting the child's development and act on those. I think that all brain disorders, whether it be anxiety, depression, possibly even schizophrenia, are due also to immune disorders. You know, in the womb, the neurologic system and the immune system are very closely linked. And so when we have an immune disorder, inflammation, an autoimmune disease, an immune dysregulation, we can also have neurologic dysregulation. And we see that with all kinds of brain disorders. So if we treat the body, we can help the brain to get better.
When we look at the idea that people automatically think that something, and especially autism, is genetic. Most people don't really understand what that means, and I think they get it wrong in the media a lot. When somebody says that it's genetic, when a researcher or when a paper comes out, the implication is that there's some sort of genetic mutation, that there's something wrong with the DNA, that it's actually been physically altered in some way. And for many years, people believed that the only way you could pass a trait on through different generations was if you literally had a physical alteration of DNA. So in autism, going back to the 70s, I believe, the first study was done looking at twin studies. So they looked at identical twins and fraternal twins. And what they found in that study was there was a very high rate, 80–90% of identical twins that had autism as a diagnosis, and there was a much lower rate for fraternal twins. Now, this was a very small study. I think there was only 10 or 12 people in the study. So at that point, the idea was that, autism must be genetic because if there's such a difference between identical and fraternal twins. There's been about 25 different studies throughout the years looking at that, and all of them kind of correlated that until a study in 2011 out of Stanford, where they really looked at the largest study, which was about 162 different pairs of twins with autism. And what they found was very different from previous studies. They found that there was actually a higher rate with fraternal twins than there was with identical twins. And what they stated in that study was that 60% or more of the factors that contributed to autism were environmental, and only about 40% or 38% were actually genetic. And this really speaks to the concept of epigenetics, which is what we really know now, that really governs most of what happens, is that there isn't actually physical damage to genes, but rather segments of genes are turned off and inhibited, usually by different chemicals or molecules in our body, methyl molecules in particular, that basically cover up and prevent that from being read. Now, in the old days, before really the 1990s, when epigenetics started to really come out, and really in 2000 when a landmark study really came out, we used to believe that during the period of conception, these epigenetic marks that basically cover up our genes and prevent them from being read, and that can really cause many different types of disorders or issues. We believed that during conception, all of those marks were wiped clean, and that a baby would start with a clean genetic slate. We now know that's not the case, that many of those marks, let's say the sins, if you will, of the adult, of the parents, can actually be passed on to the children. And we know now that different studies have shown that that can go for at least up to 11 generations that we know. So in practical terms, what does that mean? It means that if someone smokes and they have children, it's possible that some of those chemicals may actually block some genes that may not affect the adult who is smoking, but actually may affect the genes of their children and their children's children. And the genes, 85% of our genes are actually there to build our brain. So the genes that are most commonly affected are the ones that actually have to do with brain development. The good news is because they're environmental factors that in the womb and even after the child is born and even into adulthood, we can modify gene expression, or at least we're pretty sure we can, so that it's never over. It's never too late, but it's also never too early. Yeah, the way we know it, that somebody has a functional disconnection or a brain imbalance, there are a number of different clues throughout our life. Like I said, most of these start in development, really start in the womb, or maybe even preconception.
It's interesting. A lot of people think about when they're going to have a baby, the most important thing to them is, what is the nursery going to look like? They worry about, is it going to be decorated beautifully? Are they going to have the right toys to, spark their child's, neurologic development? But they don't think about the womb, which is actually the child's first home. And when it comes to neurological development and prenatal development as a whole, the most important place you really want to start working is in the womb. That's the child's first exposure, and the placenta is not as strong a barrier as we think it is. Many things can cross the placenta. In fact, there was a study done in 2005, which is one that I talk about so frequently in almost every lecture I give. It was by the Environmental Working Group, and they took a number of women and checked the cord blood after they gave birth. And what they found was over 280 different toxic chemicals in the cord blood of newborn babies. So we think that babies are protected from all of the toxins that we may be exposed to, but this clearly showed us that that is just not true. So what happens, what we take in is absolutely critical for what our children and our babies are exposed to in utero. And that can be toxic chemicals. It can be things like pesticides or BPA and other endocrine disruptors. Children can also be affected by what they don't get. They can be affected by a lack of vitamin D. We know that there are studies that show that lack of maternal deficiencies of vitamin D actually increase risk of autism. We know that selenium is linked to depression when there's a deficiency in utero. As I said, vitamin D is another one that's very, very important. Gluten enteropathy, high sugar diets actually are linked to inflammation, and inflammation is one of the things we're going to talk about a lot today, because high levels of inflammation are linked to lots of neurological disorders. So when a mom has a high sugar diet that's low in some of the nutrients she needs for development, that's going to impact babies for life. There's a study that looked at famine and its effect on development over time, and what they found was that babies who were born in times of famine, who had poor nutrition, actually had a higher incidence of Alzheimer's and cognitive decline later in life. So we see that, intake at the very earliest stages can impact life for decades. So one of the things that we struggle with in the United States is what we call the SAD diet. It's the standard American diet, and it is really very sad. It's generally really, really high in processed foods, especially foods that are grain-based. So lots of white flours, lots of sugar. These kinds of diets are what we call pro-inflammatory. Sugar is very pro-inflammatory, and one of the things we are learning more and more every day is how much sugar and inflammation is linked to chronic illness, whether it be heart disease or diabetes, but also linked to neurologic problems, including depression, anxiety, and autism.
In regard to epigenetics and what can turn genes on and off, almost anything. In my book, Autism, The Scientific Truth, I really identified around 50 different really well-documented, well-researched environmental risk factors that may elevate the risk of somebody or a couple having a child with autism or some other developmental issue. We know things like age are a factor. We know things like diabetes and hypertension and obesity are significant factors. We know stress and how someone metabolizes or how the stress affects their body is something. We know if they have different vitamin or mineral deficiencies, things like they don't have enough folic acid or iron or things like that. We know if they have activation of their immune system, so if they have things like a gluten sensitivity or they have autoimmunity, or if someone, in particular if the mother gets a flu virus, we know that elevates the risk significantly. The fact is, though, that all of these risk factors really do primarily one thing to the body. They really contribute to causing inflammation, increasing production of stress hormones, and all of those chemicals that are released during that, or activation of the immune system and inflammatory immune regulators, they are the ones that really primarily interact with genes and can alter it. So all of the different factors really do, for the most part, the same thing. In my experience and from my perspective, one of the biggest risk factors that nobody really talks about is if the adults have imbalances or functional disconnections in their own brain. If they have imbalances, or if there are areas of their brain that haven't really been as active, that haven't developed as well as they should, those imbalances create imbalances in their body. Those imbalances in their body are more likely to lead to an activation of their fight or flight system and cause inflammation, production of cortisol, all of those different chemicals in their body that may then block the expression of genes in their own children. So, any of those factors, and there are many of them, and we really learn of them every day, different things like pollution. And it's confusing because, there's one study, really good study out of California, that shows that, people and mothers in particular that live near highways and were exposed to pollution and exhaust fumes and mercury and heavy metals, that the risk of having a child with autism went up significantly. But then there was another study that showed if you live in farms and you're exposed to pesticides and fungicides and things like that, that your risk of having a child with autism goes up dramatically. That's why probably the most important thing is not only looking at your environment, but being able to really understand what's going in your own body and measure those things. And the good news is that almost all of these risk factors are modifiable or avoidable and can be eliminated. But what we need to start thinking more is really what I think preconception, more than what we've been doing. I mean, obviously giving prenatal vitamins and trying to make somebody healthy, but really being more specific and looking at all of these different factors and trying to get them into a good functional range before you get pregnant. Because if the genes are already turned off in the parents, then when you get pregnant, it's already there.
People look at prenatal diets and they think about how that should be different from a typical diet, and in most cases it should be the same. A prenatal diet should be clean. It should be, again, free of artificial ingredients such as sweeteners and colorings and preservatives. It should be rich in organic produce and good sources of pasture-fed proteins or vegetarian sources of protein. Some nutrients, though, are especially important for pregnant women, one of which is iron. And we also know that iron, or low iron in utero, can lead to cognitive challenges later in life. We see that there are IQ changes in areas where there's chronic iron deficiency. Selenium and lycopene. Lycopene is something that we find in tomatoes. Those are actually really helpful for promoting normal mood. So pregnant women really have to focus on iron. They also need zinc because zinc is very, very important for cell replication, which is obviously critical in that prenatal time. But things like iron and zinc are not found in very high quantities in processed food unless they're supplemented. And again, getting the natural form of the food is really important. Another nutrient that's critical in the prenatal period is folate. And we know that deficiencies of folate can lead to things like neural tube defects. So we actually add higher levels of folate to a lot of prenatal supplements, and we also fortify it in the food supply. Now, unfortunately, we fortify that folate in grains, which is not necessarily the area that we really want to promote lots of high intake. The other thing is the form of folate is important because folic acid is the form that is supplemented. However, there is some research that shows that there are certain genetic mutations that make some women and children less able to move that folate. Folic acid is number one synthetic, and it is not the active form. The active form is the one your body uses to do its work. And the active form of folate is something called MTHF. So when you can't process that folate and activate it, it's not as beneficial. So for some people, it's much more important to get that active form and make sure that that's the form that they're eating or consuming. So supplementation with the active form is actually often more helpful for women who are pregnant than supplementing simply with folic acid. And one of the things that you can do to know if you have this defect is get tested for something called MTHFR. And the MTHFR defect may reduce your metabolism and your ability to activate that folic acid, and knowing that in advance can help you effectively support your own folate status. One of the things that I've seen in my career is an epidemic of chronic illnesses in America's children. In fact, I did write a nutrition chapter for a book called A Compromised Generation, The Epidemic of Chronic Illness in America's Children. And it's such an important topic for me. I'm also actually on the board of an organization called the Neurological Health Foundation. And the mission for that, as well as Epidemic Answers, which I'm also on the board of, is to help reduce this epidemic of neurological and other chronic diseases in children.
I've had many, many patients with autism. One comes to mind who was a little boy, 2 or 3 years old, who was quite dramatically affected. He had regressive autism. He had a number of insults, antibiotics, infections, vaccines. All these things affected his capacity to actually develop normally. And his parents were told by the doctors, and by the way, his mother worked for a large pharma company, but they were told, you need occupational therapy, you need behavioral therapy, good luck, he'll probably end up in an institution, and we're sorry. And that message, unfortunately, is something that parents get all the time, and it makes me angry because I know there's so much we can do, because autism is not a brain disorder. It's a disorder that affects the brain. We now see dramatic amounts of inflammation in these children. We see exposure to toxins. We see all these gut dysfunctions in these kids, and dysbiosis, we call it, imbalances in the gut flora. All these things drive brain dysfunction. So by fixing those things, often the brain will recover. So I see this one young boy came in and he had terrible gut issues. They all have stinky, smelly stools, gas, diarrhea, horrible bowel movements. He had severe nutritional deficiencies, B vitamins, folate, B6, B12. He had mercury in his body. And we were able to fix all these things one at a time. And he recovered. He went from, not being able to speak to being fluent, from being in autistic class to being a normal kid in mainstream school. And now he's about 10 years old and he's completely normal, completely lost his diagnosis, happy, normal, well-adjusted kid, not even on the spectrum at all.
One of the things that's important to remember is that growing babies and children are so much smaller, obviously, than we are, that the impact of the same dose of some sort of toxin is going to be much greater on them. They're also developing their brains at that time. So the same amount that we may be exposed to as adults is generally more toxic for them. And most studies aren't done in children of that size. So when we say something may be safe, we really don't know if it's safe in utero because we really haven't tested it that way. The other thing that we haven't tested is combinations of chemicals. So we may test a chemical in isolation, but we don't test the synergy of how a combination of chemicals impacts our children, especially in utero. And that's an area where we don't know, and we really need to err on the side of caution because we really have no idea.
I was asked to be director at the Casale Institute. I had to do with child development, and I was there. Naturally, my patients belonged to CHCP. They had to stay there, but some of them would come and ask me questions, and one of them said, my neighbor's kid developed this horrible eczema, and she's really suffering from it, and the doctors are not sure. And I said, well, what was the story? And, well, my old patient knew what the story was because she knew me and what my belief system was. She took antibiotics for a strep throat, and a couple of weeks later, she broke out in all these eczema. And so she knew that the connection between the taking antibiotics and the eczema was something Sid would know about. And so she asked me if I could just talk to her friend and sort of give her a curbside sort of free consultation. I said, of course, it's simple. So I talked to the mom, and I saw the child for just a few minutes, to say what you need is a prescription for nystatin, which is a medicine that kills yeasts or funguses. And it's the growth of the funguses after the penicillin that caused the mischief. She took it, and then a few weeks later I asked my patient, or my patient called me, I guess, and said, she's all better. And her autism went away. I didn't even know the child was autistic. It wasn't on the menu, right? But their autism went away like that. Well, that's what, in my development as a physician, made a big impression on me, because to me at that time, autism was something kind of way out there in terms of different diseases. It was way off campus, so to speak. And it had this strange history of having been blamed on mothers. For years it was your mother's fault. You have a cold mother. That's why you have autism. And that was being debunked, but it was still, during my education at Yale, that was the belief system.
These are just a few stories, but if autism can be reversed or improved in one child, if there's any possibility of an effective treatment or a potential cure, it forces us to ask critical questions. How did this happen? Can it happen in other children? What were the biological patterns found, and how were they treated? The emotional and financial costs of autism for families and societies is staggering. Now 1 in 5, or 20% of children, have some type of neurodevelopmental disorder. If inflammation starts in the belly, and so many autistic children have swollen bellies, then it spreads to the brain, and it can literally lead to a swollen brain, and the effects can be disastrous. The take-home message here is that the answer to autism and other neurodevelopment disorders will not be found in one of these factors, but in all of them taken together in varying degrees in each individual. There is no such thing as autism. Rather, there are autisms, different patterns of biological dysfunction unique to each child that results in multiple insults to the brain that all manifest with the symptoms we call autism.
Well, we do a comprehensive evaluation to try to see, initially to get a better understanding, because there can be many different factors, many different causes. As one example, there are types
So there's no such thing as autism, there are autisms.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. It's just it's an umbrella sort of label that we've developed, but it actually, within that, there's so many different unique types. And it's important to identify. If you can help identify that early on with the right testing, you can target therapy and be much more successful.
So what are the different types?
So there are a subset of children for whom epilepsy is one of the main causes of their developmental problems. So the cause of their autism symptoms, the cause of their language delay, and maybe cognitive disability. So identifying the epilepsy and treating it properly can lead to dramatic improvements. So that's one example. There are some individuals who have difficulty in the stabilization and formation of synapses. They have gene mutations that affect that specific process, and there are supplements and medications now that affect and can help with the process of synapse formation and stabilization. And so if you identified that, you could then target therapies in that way.
So this is sort of going where the rest of medicine is going, which is personalized medicine. There's no such thing as autism. It's a whole series of different insults that can cause the same symptoms.
That's right.
So we've been coming out through the symptoms instead of the causes.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so identifying the autism is not the end, it's just the beginning.
Right. I always say, in medicine, we call what we do naming and blaming. We name the disease and we blame the name. The reason for your symptoms is you have autism. It's actually it's not the cause, it's just the name of the symptoms.
Right.
Instead of what I call thinking and linking. So in functional medicine, the thinking starts when you make the diagnosis. It doesn't end. And that's a huge shift in our approach in medicine.
Isn't that amazing?
It's why I call it the medicine of why, not what. Not what disease do you have, what drug do I get, but why is this happening and how do I deal with that?
Yeah. I do. I see too often that once the label of autism is given,
Incurable disease with no real treatment, yeah. And it's such a discouraging message, Yeah, and you know, those of us in the front line, you know, you have to believe what you see, not see what you believe. A lot of physicians just see what they believe instead of believing what they see, which is, you've seen it, I've seen it, a case of autism regressing or reversing.
Yes.
Not all the kids get 100% better, but they can be functional, they can have better lives, some get cured. It's really extraordinary. You're right, the younger you get them, the better it is.
Yeah.
Autism is just a label for, and a rather weak label. If you trusted things at the grocery store with just that name on it, without the fine print, you wouldn't want it. Nowadays, people are sophisticated. They say, well, let's see what's in here if they're shopping for something. And so just a label doesn't say it. So a few years ago, the word spectrum came along. And it means that a person belongs to a collection of people who represent a broad set of different colors, as in the color spectrum. It goes on really in both directions forever. And this was very helpful for doctors because they could feel more comfortable with the label where there was a lot of give and take in there and a lot of flexibility. It was not as good for patients in the sense that when the doctor says, you have myasthenia gravis, well, it's bad news, but they know what I've got, right? And so you must know what to do about it. But if they say you're in a spectrum, you feel kind of lost. Like, well, what do you mean I'm in a spectrum? But so the fact is that while it's been a blessing because it's an accurate description of reality, that there's this wide range of different manifestations of this problem called autism, it is a little bit troublesome to parents who feel, well, now how do we navigate in here? And of course, coming back to the question of the child being the expert, the navigation is done by paying attention to the details, which I'd like to talk about more as I go along here. I feel it because of a certain set of rules called the tax rules. It's not about taxation, like getting your money to the government. It's about TACKS. If you're sitting on a tack, it takes a lot of aspirin to make it feel better. The treatment for tack sitting is tack removal. So if you have a headache, where's the tack? You take the aspirin? Well, sure, you can. That's for an acute illness. So I'm not going to quibble about that. But for a chronic illness, it's a different landscape. And if there's something chronically wrong with you, and tack removal is better than taking the aspirin. And I'm not saying that drugs don't work. I'm going to leave here and go see the aunt of a boy who's been taking for some years a medicine, he's an autistic boy, a medicine for Alzheimer's disease, and called galantamine. It has to do with, blocking the disappearance of a certain brain chemical. And I tried all kinds of things for him years ago, and it was the one thing that made a big difference, even though he's taking like 3 times the adult dose, but it didn't hurt him at all. And it's called galantamine, and now I'm interested because he's gotten so much better, maybe he doesn't need it anymore, so we can take it away. But in general, we're trying to find something that is part of a person's experience inside and in the environment that needs to be adjusted, as in removing a tack. Now, the second tax rule is if you're sitting on 2 tacks, removing just one doesn't give you a 50% improvement. So, and that's helpful for people to understand that chronic illness is complex. The idea that one drug is going to do it, and the idea that just one intervention is going to do it, works sometimes very well. But sometimes it means that you're caught in an environment, a system, in which everything is connected. And the good thing about a system is sometimes if you hit a part of the system which has a good influence, that influence spreads through the system and healing takes place. On the other hand, sometimes a system is difficult because if you have something bad happen, that also can spread through the system and make for mischief. The drugs are important sometimes for acute illness, for killing bugs, but they create a lot of mischief, and that's something that we in integrative and functional medicine are especially aware of.
Rather than studying drugs that affect the brain to treat autism, the better path may be to studying treatments that target inflammation and toxins and allergens and microbes and infections, or fixing biochemical train wrecks like the problems with methylation and sulfation, as well as gut problems and mitochondrial dysfunction. Dr. Go, you've been looking at the world through a different lens since you saw this patient, Jake. And tell us how he changed your thinking about autism and how the body responds to various insults.
Sure. So this young boy was 8 years old when I met him. And I met him at the time I was co-director of the autism program at Columbia University. And I remember being so moved by him and his mother because of how much they had done along their journey with autism. So he was first diagnosed young, around 18 months, and had received a lot of very important therapies like behavior intervention and speech-language therapy. But it wasn't until he started to receive mitochondrial therapy at the age of 3.5 that things really started to change. So at that time, he wasn't speaking, he had difficulty walking, he wasn't able to run. His mother took him to Johns Hopkins University to have additional testing, and mainly metabolic and mitochondrial testing. And it was there that a diagnosis of mitochondrial dysfunction with autism was made, and he was started on a series of vitamins and supplements that over the course of weeks and months radically changed his developmental trajectory. So he began to speak, began to interact socially, his gross motor and fine motor skills improved dramatically. And so he continued those therapies up until when I met him, which was at age 8. And at that point, he had been doing well, he was mainstreamed in school, but he was beginning to refuse to take the large quantity of vitamins and supplements. And so he'd been inconsistent with that, and he was having a period of regression. So his symptoms were worsening. So he'd made dramatic progress, and now he was struggling again. He was struggling in social interaction, high levels of anxiety, headaches, daily migraine headaches, and obsessive compulsive behaviors. So severe that he had trouble walking down a sidewalk because he was retracing his steps. It's hard to get out of the house in the morning. And so this was, of course, alarming to his parents. And with resuming mitochondrial therapy through L-carnitine, coenzyme Q10, B vitamins, some very basic supplements, he began to improve again. And now he's a thriving junior high school student, plays competitive travel soccer, is in a mainstream school, and is doing incredibly well.
It's an extraordinary story. And yet when you go to the doctor, most of the time they don't know how to diagnose mitochondrial dysfunction and probably never heard of mitochondrial therapy.
That's right.
Tell us about your work in mitochondrial discovery of how this is connected to autism. Because mitochondria is the place where we make energy. And it seems like a lot of his symptoms were an energy deficit.
Yes. He had very low tone, fatigue, delayed milestones, all of which are associated with mitochondrial impairment.
What are mitochondria anyway?
So mitochondria, if you think about the cells of the body, nearly all the cells of the body have inside of them mitochondria. And mitochondria are they're classified as a subcellular organelle, so they're tiny structures inside of cells.
Like a cell within a cell.
Yes. And a cell can have dozens or up to thousands of mitochondria. And mitochondria are sometimes called the powerhouse of the cell because one of their main functions is to generate energy. And they do that in the form of ATP, which is thought of as the currency or the fuel, the energy currency for the body. So mitochondria are a powerhouse. They do a lot of other things. It's interesting that they're called the powerhouse because, in fact, they're actually very delicate structures, and they're very sensitive to environmental factors, stress, toxins, oxidative stress.
They're easily damaged.
They're easily damaged, but they're so important for all of the body's functions. And the brain is particularly dependent on the function of mitochondria because it has such a high energy demand. So the developing brain is hugely impacted by mitochondrial function.
It's like you run out of gas, right? Your brain doesn't work. And so, the brain doesn't have a lot of ways of responding to insults. And when you lose mitochondria, you get all sorts of problems, whether it's Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autism. And, as you said, the mitochondria are really sensitive to insults. So what have you found are the worst offenders in damaging the mitochondria?
There's a term that's sometimes used called secondary mitochondrial dysfunction, meaning not due to a genetic cause, but due to other factors like inflammation, physiological stressors, medications. So there are some medications that are known to be toxic to mitochondria.
Like statins.
Yes, yes. Very widely used medications. Some antibiotics, some commonly used psychiatric medications that are commonly used in children, in young children with autism, like risperidone.
That's an antipsychotic.
Yes, and it's very, very widely used in the treatment of autism. Mitochondria can be impacted by so many different factors.
And you mentioned toxins in your work, that you discovered the load of environmental toxins. You talk about the work of Phil Landrigan, who's, an amazing scientist who's really connecting the dots between environmental insults and autism and ADD and behavioral issues.
So important that there are many chemicals and industrial chemicals and pesticides that are widely used that we know clearly have toxicity to the developing brain. Many of those chemicals impact the function of mitochondria. So it's very likely that at least one mechanism by which they harm the brain is by impairing mitochondria.
And also the mitochondria essentially are the processing factories for the food we eat. And they respond differently to different foods.
Right.
So one of the big insults we know is that sugar is a mitochondrial toxin. And it's ubiquitous. The average kid has 34 teaspoons of sugar and is a day. So how does that impact mitochondria?
Well, nutrient intake or the lack of certain key nutrients is probably one of the biggest factors that affect mitochondria. So we know a lot about the machinery, the delicate machinery inside mitochondria, and that a lot of that is impacted by oxidative stress. So when there are these molecules in excess called free radicals, they can do damage to mitochondria.
Oh, it's like rusting.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like a car rusting or apple turning brown, and that process happening inside of us.
Yes, and the things that we eat day to day, even within the course of a day, impact. It's that dynamic. The system is that impact.
So what are the kinds of foods that actually hurt the mitochondria, and what are those that help the mitochondria?
So we think that the foods that are helpful to the mitochondria are foods that are rich in antioxidants, that have our natural source of, for example, B vitamins. There are foods that are natural sources of coenzyme Q10. Coenzyme Q10 is key in one aspect of the mitochondria called the respiratory chain that is directly involved in the generation of ATP.
So what would that be that has CoQ10 in it?
A lot of foods that we may not want to be. So liver. Liver has
Yeah, liver's good. Liver's got B vitamins. Liver's a mitochondrial food.
Yes.
Yeah.
Carnitine, for example, which is in high concentration in meat products.
Yeah, particularly lamb.
Is important for shuttling fats into mitochondria where they can then be metabolized into energy.
So let's talk about fats. You mentioned fats. So, we've seen a lot of literature come out that fats really are an important fuel for the mitochondria. Certain kinds of fats actually help the mitochondria work better, like MCT oil. What do you have to say about that research?
Well, I think we know that the importance of lipids in, for example, cell membrane integrity. And the mitochondria have their own membrane. The integrity of that membrane is very important for the function of mitochondria. In fact, many of the key processes happen along the inner mitochondrial membrane. So lipids from fats are important for those types of things. We understand that mitochondria are very sensitive to inflammation, and that healthy lipids can help regulate the body's inflammation.
We have an integrative practice that it tries to integrate all of the therapies to treat autism. I started my career as a teacher, so I'm very invested in behavioral therapy and other therapies for kids with autism. But we have to look at what's going on for them medically. So first and foremost, diet. The gut is not the second brain, I think it's the first brain. So if we're not giving our kids a good anti-inflammatory, whole foods, non-processed diet, we're not doing the right thing by them. Then we look at what supplements, what minerals, what vitamins they may be needing, and we do that. Then we look at other illnesses like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, NMDA encephalitis, and see what we can learn from those diseases and what medications or supplements help those people that may also help our kids with autism. And then we also look at homeopathy, intuitive therapy, and other therapies that may help them in general. One of those may be hyperbaric oxygen. We don't use it in every kid, but in children with inflammation, with Lyme disease, with cerebral palsy, with traumatic brain injury and concussions, it may be an adjunct to the other therapies that we use. Hyperbaric oxygen is where you give oxygen at a higher percentage. You know, what we're breathing is 21% oxygen. And so depending on the unit, you can give anywhere from concentrated oxygen, which is like 28 to 35%, to up to 100% oxygen. But more importantly, you give it at an increased pressure. So you help that oxygen to get into the cells and decrease the inflammation and also improve the mitochondrial function, because that's something else that's affected in a lot of our kids. The mitochondria are the energy cells of all of our body. And so when our energy cells are not working, our energy is dysregulated. That doesn't mean we may be lethargic. We may be, like with chronic fatigue, but we may also be revved, like we see in our kids with autism. It's sort of like that car idling that the engine revs without us pressing on the gas. That's what our kids with autism are like, and HBOT can also help that.
Treating the gut and giving B12, B6, and folate, giving omega-3 fats and vitamin D and vitamin A, and magnesium and zinc, eliminating gluten and casein from the diet, detoxifying mercury and lead from their little bodies may be the best way to get autistic children's brain connections working again.
Obviously, you know, when we look at what nutrients are important for the brain, it really kind of depends on what that individual needs. So to a certain extent, that's the whole point of functional medicine and functional neurology, is that it's really directed towards the individual. It's based on measuring what their individual needs are. But certainly, there are some basic things that I tell just about everybody. Omega-3s, and in particular DHA, obviously is very important for the brain, for the membrane of the brain itself. You know, so that it remains fluid and that it doesn't start to break down, and that we can get proper exchange of nutrients and ions. That's really important. Vitamin D, I think, is hugely important because it helps to balance out the immune system, and it helps to really support a lot of our digestive function. And so, you know, maybe limiting what foods we become sensitive to. And I think, you know, it's probably the most important immune factor. And if we have an imbalance in the immune system, like I said, that really can cause a lot of problems, cause a breakdown of our blood-brain barrier, a breakdown of our gut, and really lead to some big issues. Obviously, as we've discussed, folic acid and B12, I think a lot of the B vitamins are very important for brain itself. I think that CoQ10 and looking at things that help support mitochondrial function are really important. We know that a lot of the issues that we see is when the mitochondria, which is really the energy source of the brain cells, when that starts to break down and become dysfunctional, that's when all hell kind of breaks loose in our brain. And that probably ends up leading to many chronic neurodegenerative issues, you know, a process what we call excitotoxicity. Magnesium can be helpful to help diminish that. It helps to lower that fight or flight response in our body and helps to improve blood flow. And I think probiotics, obviously, because the gut health is really important, and, you know, especially for the brain, that the brain and the gut interact with one another. And so therefore, if the brain isn't working properly, we get a breakdown of that, you know, that gut biome. But being able to try to reestablish that and restore that is very important as well. So I think, you know, at the most basic level, I look at, you know, omega-3s, vitamin D, probiotics, and then, you know, also along with vitamin D, we usually recommend vitamin A and vitamin K to go along with that. And then, I like to look really individually at the individual person and see what they need. I do recommend that if you can, obviously try to eat foods that are rich in those particular nutrients. But because if the person has this high fight or flight system on, you can give them a lot of vitamins and you can have them eat food and they're not going to digest it properly. When you have kids that are in this fight or flight, which again, anybody that has a developmental issue, we're born with our sympathetic fight or flight system more active. And we've actually shown that kids with autism and ADHD, they have a persistence of that through their life, meaning they're always more in this fight or flight. And the most effective thing you can do is actually to create balance in their brain and stimulate brain growth and development. You can do other things like eliminating foods or eliminating triggers, but if the digestive problems or the inflammation or the things that are also triggering some of this fight or flight, if they're from the brain, then all you're doing is really just putting out fires. So you ultimately need to really deal with the brain issues, but identifying foods or identifying different environmental triggers that might lead to inflammation or activation of the immune system or toxins in our body, those are also very, very important to help reduce that fight or flight system. Basically using a bottom-up or a top-down approach or both is really what we do with every child that we work with. We have centers all across the country and we'll work with, thousands of kids this year, and we've worked with tens of thousands of kids and families. And in all of those, what I developed was a way of really assessing, their development and looking at, did their bottom-up processes, did the maturity and development of their brain happen the way it was supposed to, or did they get stuck somewhere along the way? And then also looking at if it did get stuck, did it affect really more right brain development or left brain development? And then what do we have to do to try to stimulate growth at that level? So it's very important to really identify where in the development the problem really came about. And then we need to go back to that and really, kind of build that bridge again. So looking at primitive reflexes is really important.
There are so many people out there who are suffering from a broken brain. Help us get this important information to them by sharing this docuseries with your community. Attention deficit disorder, known as ADD, today also referred to as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, is not a Ritalin deficiency. Yet the use of these drugs is skyrocketing. 1 in 10 American kids are on stimulant medication. In fact, the global use of ADHD medication rose 300% from 1993 to 2000.
I think it was age 8 when I was first prescribed ADD medication, Ritalin. And I remember I would have to go to the school nurse and take it in the middle of the day. I thought it was special for me. I was on and off those ADD medications throughout school. That was the earliest prescription, age 8 in 3rd grade. And then the last time I took it was in March of 2012. So, that's about 15 years. The better part of 15 years, I was regularly having ADD medication and using that to get by. The side effects of ADD medication are I don't even know what to say. It's like knowing now, having been off of ADD medication for about 4 or 5 years now, looking back on how I felt every day on ADD medication, especially in college and in high school, is astounding to recall. So it's like I could just list things. So the first thing that I remember ADD medication really messing with is my sleep. In college, I was at the point my senior year where I would sleep in 2-hour blocks because that was how I could manage getting my homework done. So I would take the Adderall and it would keep me awake, And then eventually I'd start to crash. So I'd try and take a nap. I'd go home and close the blinds and put a blanket over my head and wake up a couple hours later, then take another dose of Adderall and start studying again. So sleep was majorly affected by the Adderall. Another thing I found is that I felt the Adderall could enrage me. I think Adderall causes more emotional extremes. So if you're frustrated by something, you're more likely to become a little enraged when you're on the Adderall. The same thing goes for maybe sadness. If something happens, something happens with a friend, you feel more down, like a low afterward, and it's really just ups and downs emotionally, I feel, on the Adderall. So I remember pretty distinctly the moment, actually, that I decided I should not be taking these ADD drugs anymore. It was like the day I finished my last final exam of college, right? So I really was, I have a degree in physics. I love to tell people that, but I scraped by in college. I was getting D's. I failed a couple classes and had to retake them. So it was the last day of my final exams. I had finished. I was so relieved, and I was so sleep deprived. I had used Adderall to keep myself awake. I'd probably slept 6 hours in like the last 48 or 72 hours. And I was doing something around the house, and this feeling of sickness, I can still remember, almost in my stomach and my head, like a physical sensation of illness from being so sleep deprived as a result of taking the Adderall. I think I went to go close the trunk door on my car, and like my shoulder did this weird thing, and I realized like I almost had limited control over my body because of how sleep deprived I was, like physically. I lacked physical control, and I said, man, like something's wrong with me. Like this feels so terrible. I need to find another way. So I ended up Googling alternative remedies for ADD treatment. And I actually stumbled upon a book, The Ultramind Solution by Dr. Hyman, and it had good Amazon reviews. I had never seen anything like it before, so I ordered it. And I think I got through it over the next month or so. So of course at the time I needed Adderall to even think about reading a book. So it's ironic because I was using the Adderall at that time. The only way I knew how to get through a book was on these drugs, right? So I got through the book, and I'm reading it, reading the Ultramind Solution. And it was really a little far out to me at the time. I'm thinking, like food changes the way I feel. Like I eat bread every day. I remember my regular lunch in college was like a baguette and cheese. So I actually remember reading the Ultramind Solution and having a lot of skepticism when I read it. And I was thinking like, is this true? Like, could this really be true? It's just coming from this one book. But the thing that got me is that there were many references to scientific studies from very established institutions, like universities. So, I remember looking, the works were all cited in the back of the book, and I said like, okay, this is pretty convincing. Like, maybe I should try some of these things. So that was the beginning. And that was my first exposure to it.
ADD, or attention deficit disorder, also called ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they're just different names for the same thing. And it affects probably 10% of the population. So most people who have it actually don't know that they have it. Short attention span, distractibility, restlessness, disorganization for things like time and space, so their rooms tend to be a mess, they tend to be late, and impulse control issues. ADD is, our research and many others, lower activity in the front part of the brain. The front part of the brain is the brain's brake. It stops you from saying every stupid thought you have. And when it's low, people with ADD get themselves into trouble because they say things that might hurt someone else's feelings. They do things without thinking it all the way through. Now, all of us do that at some point in life. We didn't sleep, we had a bad day. But people who have ADD, it's just been part of their life for most of their life. So people have ADD, I mean, really it's anybody that's struggling with their mind should seek help when their symptoms are really beginning to interfere with their life. They're interfering with reaching their potential at school, at work, in relationships, or with their health. And the thing I love about what we do here at Amen Clinics is we actually look at people's brains. And yes, you can change them. I mean, that's the coolest thing. But when you optimize someone's brain, their schoolwork is better, their work is better, their relationships are better, and people begin to get toward their potential, which really makes them happy. So when I first started looking at the brain in 1991, I thought ADD was one thing. And there's already published research then that ADD was low activity in the frontal lobes. But the more clearly ADD people I sent, the more I realized it wasn't one thing in the brain. And initially, I made 4 subtypes based on the imaging work, and then it was 5, and then it was 6, and recently we added a 7th type. And the important thing about that is if you give everybody Ritalin, 2 of the types get better, 5 of them get worse, which is why Ritalin has a bad reputation. For the right type, it's amazing. For the wrong type, it's a nightmare.
The Ultramind solution lifestyle changes, the first things that I saw were changes in my exercise habits. And within about 3 years after that, or 4 years after that, I could say that I had completed 3 marathons. So in 2015, I ran the New York Marathon and the Chicago Marathon. My wife and I did that together. So, you know, it's a pretty stark contrast to say I had no interest in running half a lap when I was growing up, but now I can call myself an endurance athlete if I want to. So I had gotten a job out of college at the end of 2012, and of course, to even feel comfortable in my first professional environment, I was still dependent on the Adderall. I wanted to show up to work and, you know, have all the focus I could, but I started slowly, maybe skipping it a day and seeing how that felt. Besides my hunger changing from not having amphetamines in my system, it was definitely a rough period of change. I remember it was about 3 weeks of me feeling like I had to be sneaky and get away with things at work. I had to hide the fact that I was not nearly as attentive on the Adderall. So it was like a 3-week transition period after totally stopping the Adderall to feeling normal, like I could actually think. Even with the lifestyle changes that allowed me to wean myself off the Adderall, it still took at least 3 weeks of pretty heavy withdrawal just to feel comfortable and competent in a professional setting, at least. Kids who are growing up now with ADD or who take ADD medication to feel comfortable achieving their goals, I would say that you have to trust me. I was there, and there is a better way. If you think that Adderall is the only way you can think clearly right now, you're dead wrong, because once you adopt the right lifestyle changes, you will be miles and miles ahead of where you are right now.
Since when did this become a normal consequence of being a child? Back in the day, it wasn't that long ago, we had maybe 1 troubled kid in the classroom. How do we go from that to 1 in 10 kids with ADHD today? The real question becomes what causes ADHD and why is it so prevalent? ADHD is just a name that we give to people who share a collection of symptoms. They can't focus or pay attention, they're inattentive, and they're hyperactive. These are symptoms. What are the causes? Well, it could be many things. Nutritional deficiencies, bacterial intestinal overgrowth, detox imbalances, leaky gut, or chronic inflammation.
Colin suffered from behavioral issues at home as well as some learning difficulties at school. He was very unfocused at school, and he also had some digestive issues that were unresolved with conventional medications. So we were really kind of looking for a solution for him. I would say from a very early age, like maybe around 2, we had behavioral issues at home. And then from there, once he entered school, is when we noticed the learning disabilities and the problem with the focus. And then around that time also, he had the stomach issues. We sought alternative options by around like 5.5. Towards the end of kindergarten, we went to see Dr. Bohem.
I used to feel a little out of control, and I couldn't I used to have like stomach problems, and I might like rage sometimes. But once I turned to my diet, I felt a lot better on myself.
Colin's behavior was really unpredictable with the ADHD. Sometimes he would be okay, and then at other times he could have an explosive outburst that I would feel difficult to control, especially with my other children around. It was hard. It really impacted all of us because his behavior was so unpredictable. There was one day I remember he had went to a camp and they had fed him a lot of ice cream, candy, drinks that had the artificial colorings in it. He came home and had the biggest meltdown he had ever had. And that's kind of where I started to think possibly the diet was related, even though regular doctors had told me no. And I just couldn't control him in front of my other kids. I was actually crying. I was so upset, and it was kind of my low point. I can't have my other kids seeing me not be able to help Colin. We tried to, basically through counseling, I had seen psychological counselors for him, maybe starting at age 2, to try to help with the behavior issues. And they gave me some advice, some tactical advice, but nothing that really seemed to make a big difference. Dr. Bohem was amazing. She spends so much time with you. She really looked at Colin as a whole person and did some testing that we had never thought to try. And then the diet was just so huge. We worked with a nutritional counselor up at Ultra Wellness, and she was really helpful with giving us advice on how to change our diets to something that was better for Colin. It was definitely a little bit hard to change the diet at first. It's a lot of undertaking, but we felt that it was necessary to really help Colin, and our whole family adopted the diet as well, so that kind of made it easier. And also I think given Colin's young age, that was helpful too, that he was more willing to adapt. So our old diet was, I would say, a typical standard American diet. It was what I considered healthy. It was, whole grains, and, we would eat things like whole wheat bread. But now our diet is gluten-free and organic, and our meat is pasture raised and grass-fed. And we also, we're almost 100% organic. We really cut back on the packaged foods that we used to eat. And if we do eat packaged goods, we really check the labels to make sure they're low in sugar. We certainly don't eat anything with high fructose corn syrup, things like that. Those were things that I didn't know back then that were not good for brain health.
It's important for all of us, and especially for our children, to really be watching, keeping the junk food away. Junk food's also high in additives and food coloring. And there's been multiple studies to show that these food colorings and additives can have an impact on our children's attention and focus. And we can see good improvements in kids' attention and focus when we take them off of these processed foods and foods that have food coloring adding to them. Some of the most important things for improving your children's diet is first of all, just having good, healthy food available. We know that when there's good, healthy food around, kids will choose healthy food. So you want to get the junk food, get the processed food out of the house, and have healthy food around. Have vegetables cut up so kids can snack on them. Have fruit available. In addition, get your children involved in cooking, and get your children involved in the food that you provide for the family. When children are involved in cooking and food preparation, they're much more excited to try new and different foods. And so it's really a great thing that you can do for your kids is get them involved in the kitchen, get them cutting up the vegetables, get them preparing the foods, because they're more likely to choose and eat them.
She was interested in what we were eating, Dr. Boham. She was very interested to see, what our diet looked like. She also was interested in Colin's overall blood work, and she did some testing to find out, we found out that he was not absorbing B12 properly, which would be a huge thing for brain health. So she had him take a sublingual B12 supplement. She really had a lot of supplements to recommend, whereas the regular doctor just had over-the-counter, if for any stomach issues, they just recommended over-the-counter medications. I would say we tried to start them right away, but it's a bit of a slow process when you're learning a new way of cooking and a new way of eating, so it took us some time. But I would say we saw changes in Colin right away, and pretty much within a couple months, we saw dramatic changes. We didn't see as many outbursts with Colin. His behavior seemed calmer. He seemed more focused. He really just seemed happier overall. Colin now is just such a different kid. He's more confident. He is doing so well in school. He just finished 3rd grade. He's reading on reading level. He got into the accelerated math group this year. So it's just been such a game changer for him that the lifestyle changes were huge. I would suggest other parents look at the diet their children are eating. We've been told for so long that the standard American diet is a healthy option, but really I think we need to look further and make sure that we're eating more organic, and also even balancing meals, with protein and fat in each meal is really important for Colin to keep his blood sugar stable. So I would say that there are other options than just medication.
Well, I would say they should change from the diet and eat a little bit healthier from a diet they might be eating. So that's one of the things I think they should change on to.
I would definitely recommend Dr. Boham and the Ultra Wellness Center. They just have such a personalized medicine approach. They take the time to really listen to you, and they will really get to the root cause of your problems, I think.
One of my biggest challenges in my practice is how to convince a child to avoid sugar and food colors, for that matter also. They get exposed to a lot of toxic red dye, food colors, all the snacks, they almost always have food colors. So sugar is a big challenge. And I almost always recommend elimination diet for the parents, and spend quite a bit of time in teaching them how to eliminate the food and then reintroduce, and then kind of develop insight, the child's insight into how that particular food is affecting. And so it's a big challenge. It's very difficult to control the diet of a 10, 11, 12-year-old child. Because if they don't get it at home, they can get it from outside, and so it becomes a real big challenge. But once the child develops some insight that, no, this is causing this kind of a problem for me, then they will avoid it. Sometimes the parents know themselves, but it's hard for them to implement the diet. And so we kind of use them different strategies, and I felt more successful when the child agrees with you. And so most of the work is to educate the child and to educate the parents. So an example, elimination of gluten, for example. I tell kids and the parents to not take gluten for 2 weeks. So you'd want to avoid anything that has gluten, go into a gluten-free diet for 2 weeks. And then after 2 weeks for lunch, take gluten-containing food, pasta or whatever it may be. And then in an hour or two, observe your behavior. And most kids will say that I feel sluggish and tired, or they'll say I feel awful, and then you're successful. But some kids will not even notice that. Even if they notice, they'll probably minimize it. It's almost always depends on the intensity of the presentation. The intensity, the severity of the symptoms. That's a very important determinant.
For parents that have a child, I don't like to say picky, a limited eater. It's challenging. I think all children go through phases, and until I was a parent, I didn't really understand, the whole dynamic that's involved, and again, how much of a role food plays for people, even in asserting their independence. Well, I always encourage parents, and this is kind of how I think a lot of us were raised way back when, but what's provided is provided. The parents decide what's going to be eaten and when it's going to be provided, and then you leave it up to the children to decide whether they're going to eat it. It's a little bit uncomfortable because none of us want our children to go hungry, but very few children will do that. Learning to eat is such a life skill that I think a lot of our parents, unfortunately, either they didn't learn it or they're just worried about, whether their child's going to eat enough, that they don't allow them to navigate that and learn it on their own. And I think it's really important to have children exposed to food and new foods and let them, try things or not try things and just get comfortable that it takes a little time for them to adapt to new foods or new ways of eating. But a lot of it's a good role modeling, and this is what we have, and then just not putting pressure on them to necessarily eat that food. And most children come around to eventually eating some of them and getting more comfortable. And then, I think grow into adults that, have better eating skills and cooking skills and all of that too. A lot of our families choose to kind of make dietary changes together. So other siblings that might be involved in the family, because it's really a supportive impact to that child, and they don't feel as isolated making some of these dietary changes. And again, it can be challenging with school activities and parties and all of that, but this is where there are a lot of products out there that we work with our patients to find some things that work for them that they can put together, to have them stay pretty much low sugar and, off of certain foods that might be bothering them. I really try to focus too on what to eat. For these children, it's critical. A lot of them need support with their detoxification system. So getting in vegetables and kind of any way we can, and into smoothies and juices, green juices, things like that, can be really, really supportive for their detoxification system. And good quality fats. I mean, pretty much all of our children get on a good quality fish oil. Very few of them are eating fish. We find their omega-3 fatty acids to be very low. And we were talking before about the developmental brain. I mean, these children, their brains are developing, and they need those building blocks. So getting like a good quality fish oil and some of the oils that you get from some of the seeds and things are really important too. So that I would kind of put at top of the list of something to focus on, what to give your child who might be dealing with some of the cognitive issues.
If you or your child or someone you know and love is dealing with ADHD, there are things you can do starting today to minimize your symptoms and get back to your life.
Any parent that is struggling with a child with any of the labels, learning disabilities, ADHD, autism, and quite honestly, in our centers, maybe up to 50% of the people that come in don't even have a label, but they know they're struggling. There's two things that really parents should be aware of and will give them a clue if the problem is primarily a brain imbalance. And that's, did they meet all their developmental milestones? And also, does your child have this real unevenness of skills? This is something that we see that parents come in with all the time, that they're really good at certain things. They're really good at playing with Legos, or they're really good remembering, directions, or they have great eye contact. But yet they can't read, or they can't remember something. And so most parents are aware, and that's confusing to them because they see these really great skills that their child has, and the teacher may even see that. But then they struggle so much in other areas. The important thing to understand is what you're looking at is this developmental imbalance. And the good news is that, those things are changeable at any point. And many parents are out there, and it really kills me that they're, believe that their child is broken or that their family is broken. And, over 80% of families end up in divorce if they have, children with developmental issues like autism. And it's so important for parents to understand that the child is never broken, that you can change these things at almost any stage. And not only change them, but most of the kids that I work with are really gifted. And they're so gifted in certain areas of their brain, that certain areas of the brain are so strong, certain networks are so good relative to other people, that they're more susceptible to an imbalance, because if the environment doesn't properly stimulate the growth and development during one stage of development, then they're more likely to develop an imbalance because they're so good in certain areas. So, you know, never give up on the child, and there's always hope, and you know, we see it all the time, and I think people really need to just educate themselves and stay away from anybody that tells you, you know, there's nothing you can do, just accept it, just be happy with the small stuff. You know, anybody that's saying that to you, just run away from them as fast as you can, and really, you know, educate yourself. I think my books are a really good source of where to start off, because it gives them a different perspective on, you know, what actually is out there. But exercises, diet, nutrition, there are so many great people doing so many great innovative things that, you know, I think, you know, they can really see things that will change their life and really get their children to be who they always knew they would be. I think that's kind of the greatest thing when parents come up to me and say, you know, you really gave us the child that we always knew was there, that couldn't get out. And now here he is, or here she is. And, you know, usually, of course, they're crying and I'm crying at that point. But, you know, to me, there's nothing more important. There's nothing more important than being able to help a child that's struggling, to be able to help a family, and to be able to restore their hopes and dreams. And that's really, you know, my main message is never give up, and, you know, always keep hope, and you'll find the answers.
I think we often use the analogy of an onion, and onions just make me cry. But if we look at our children as a gift, and when they have autism, they may be wrapped in many layers of wrapping paper. And what we do as integrative physicians is try to unwrap those many layers of wrapping paper to get to the true gift inside. But whether we get to that true gift or they have several layers of wrapping paper, seeing that child as a gift can help them to see themselves as a gift. So that's number one. The second thing is look for somebody else that's been through this. There's a great group of parents, talk about curing autism, and they have many mentors that can be very helpful to parents. Looking at other SPEDNET groups, NAA, finding other parents that have been through this that can help lead you down the right path. I think look at your child's total body. I always say kids crave that which they're most sensitive to. So if your child's craving a certain food, like milk for instance, take it out 100% for 3 weeks and see what happens. You may see a different child at the end of those 3 weeks. If you don't, then pig out on it and see if you see any regression. But just start with one thing. Find one thing that may make a difference for your child and try that, and don't give up.
ADD or ADHD is definitely something that we're seeing a lot of, and perhaps a lot more of these days. And our culture is ADD-ogenic, and has been. That's what we call it, meaning it produces people with short attention spans. And that's because of our wonderful little gadgets that we are addicted to, from our cell phone to TV to video games to all the wonderful things that we have that make life very easy and make us into a situation where we're not training frustration tolerance in our kids because all they have to do is start again in a video game or start it over. And this means they don't have to really pay attention for that long, and we're now used to the 6-second commercials and videos and even TV and movies are quick to get us into a novel situation or a novel scene, because that's what holds people's attention. It's such a tough call as to what to tell parents about technology, because it's so ever present. And if the parents say to their kids, oh, you can't have a cell phone or you can't use the iPad, and they're constantly on it, which is the case most of the time, it falls on deaf ears. So one has to be a family that says, okay, we're going to limit our screen time, which is now about 9 hours a day on average, okay, for all of us. And that means our kids are seeing this. One of I just have 2 grandchildren, and one of the things that we've learned by getting them to do things like crawl forward rather than backwards for my youngest, what was the object of excitement and interest that she crawled towards? It wasn't the teddy bear. It wasn't her little dolly at the age of 1. What was it? The cell phone. That was what she wanted, and that's what she crawled to. That was, and that's indicative of our society.
Also, in current day society, we're dealing with a lot of social media, and little kids now are playing video games instead of back in the day where they used to go out and play football and be interactive. And so again, there's a lot more of that isolation, and that whatever channel, whatever video game they're on, that's also affecting their relationships and their mental health. So I mentioned social media, but social media can go both positive and negative. So for example, actually if someone is a bipolar parent, they're concerned maybe their child will develop bipolar, then they have that opportunity that they could actually seek out support groups online. They could look to see if there's maybe a local group, maybe there's educational resources out there. Luckily, going online isn't as expensive as it used to be. So if someone is concerned, they can go online, read resources, get educated, and further seek help instead of, sometimes people can actually soothe themselves with, instead of proper medications, they try to soothe themselves with substances, and that could actually go down to a worse path. So I'm not sure if social media per se is training our kids and adults to have ADHD, but I am aware. I was watching CNN the other day, and a lot of the apps that they're creating, it creates a addictive type of drive where, especially a lot of the video games, even with the way we text, and the incentives it provides, the emojicons, all of that, it kind of creates this where we're getting used to the stimulation of the TV, of the iPad, of our iPhone, and it's a rewarding system. So it does create a lot of, depending on what apps kids are looking at, it does create a lot of mental health issues, such as it can create anxiety, some addiction, ADHD, and things like that. So how do I prevent that from happening? I think it needs to happen from young age. You need to limit your kids from playing video games. You need to be aware of what video games exactly they're playing, and monitor them. I think monitoring is a huge effort of being aware of what your children are doing, because that's what's going to create, good habits or actually poor habits, instead of having your child be sticking an iPad in front of them so that you don't have to worry about, calming them down. But are you going to stick that iPad for 5 hours in front of them and get them hooked on to that game? Or are you going to limit something where it's more educational and have them, be there for half an hour, learn something actually, and then actually bring them to the dinner table without the iPad and say, okay, let's have a family dinner. Let's communicate where we have the emotional warmth instead of this, cold iPad in front of us.
I think that one of the reasons psychiatrists have been so kind of put on the forefront in the last several years is this increase in rate of diagnosis of ADD. And there's been a big pushback from people saying, why is there suddenly we're over-diagnosing everything? And my personal thought for years has just been the way that we live in real life, when we go to school or we go to a job where you sit in a cubicle, you have to sit at a desk and not move, is so completely different to the speed at which information comes when we're not at work and kids aren't in school. So they can get on the internet and everything's fast, and they play these video games that go really fast, and then they have to go and just sit and listen to someone speak. And we're surprised that they can't pay attention. So it's an interesting question to look at, because why would we give all these people stimulants? Why would we give everyone medication to treat something that comes from, overstimulation and kind of change in environments?
I spent 25 years in show business. So retrospectively, when I think about it, I was working with dysregulated brains for a really long time. I just didn't know exactly what I could do about it other than try to manage their behaviors. But that career sort of waned in its interest for me, and somewhere towards the end of it, I had a daughter who was clearly a little different. It's our first child, and her interactions with the world were just a little behind. Nothing that was overtly would sound an alarm, but we observed as parents there was something probably a little developmentally delayed in her, let's put it that way. So we got her into kindergarten, first grade, and all of a sudden the demands of life became much more apparent. Then her interactions with the world became more obvious to us, not so much when she was just hanging out with us at home. So we went on a journey to find out what this was all about, and we had several different diagnoses. It was sensory processing disorder, there was attention deficit disorder, I think there was one more in there, I can't even remember what it was. But we finally ended up with an autism diagnosis, the subset of which was PDD-NOS, which is frankly very evocative of my daughter. Pervasively developmentally delayed, not otherwise specified, we don't know. And I was like, yeah, that sounds about right. But it set us on a journey of trying to figure out what we could do to help this kid. And she had behaviors that were really challenging. She'd scream and run out across the street through traffic. I mean, it was stuff that was really quite dangerous at times. And so in an effort to try to find out how we could help manage these, we visited the doctors like you all do. What's wrong with my kid? Went to a developmental pediatrician who sent us to UCLA, and we got this diagnosis, and we got into the system. And the system is designed by and large to manage behaviors. And so we got into the psychopharmacological arena. She must have done 15 or 20 major medications over a couple of year period. Anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, you get on the list. We tried just about everything to try to get some of these things to work for her so that she could at least calm herself down to the point where she could have a meaningful interaction with the world. And to an extent they worked. She wasn't as destructive, she wasn't as rageful, she wasn't a lot of things. She also, she also wasn't my daughter. She was just this, it came very clear to us. We were at a holiday party at school, and all the kids are singing and they have little hats on and doing all this stuff. And my daughter was, oddly enough, right in the center and was staring vacantly out into space. Not singing, she could have been on the moon. It was unimportant where she was. She was not interacting with her world. So we said, okay, this is not going to happen. I can't live like this. I can't live with this, what I'm doing to this child. I mean, the guilt, you saw me choke up a second ago, that's from my own guilt of what I did with the best of intentions. I mean, no disrespect to anybody we were involved with. Everybody is trying to find a solution for these kids and try to find what we can put together that's going to make them functional. And I said, okay, but this road of pharmacology clearly is not happening for us. The side effects are too profound, weight gains and lethargy and excessive sleep, and just get on the list. Mostly it was that vacantness that distressed me so much and distressed my wife. So a friend told us about this thing called neurofeedback. What's that? Oh, it's just that they put these things on your head, it trains the brain. Okay, well, sure, we'll try it. We were trying anything. And I went to a couple of different practitioners. Joy Lunt, who's a veteran, has been doing this for 30 years. Shout out to Joy. We did traditional neurofeedback, QEEG guided neurofeedback. And we also fortuitously ran into another practitioner who did this different form of neurofeedback, this infralow frequency training, which is how I ended up getting involved with it. The brain is an amazing organ. It seeks information, it seeks homeostasis, it seeks to find calm. It needs to reduce fear. It looks for and strategizes ways to manage its own behavior. So any information you give it, it will take it in and it'll try to do something with it. But through this process of neurofeedback, we got her to the point where we could get her off all of her medications. If it did nothing other than that, I would have been thrilled. If it just got her off her meds, I would have been happy. But we noticed an increase in her ability to interact with people, to skill sets. I mean, silly things. I mean, I'm not silly in a sense if you're struggling with this. One of our symptoms that we look for in clients who come to us, we ask them about their handwriting. People go, what are you asking me about my handwriting for? It is remarkable across ADD, autism spectrum disorder, any number of conditions. Handwriting is a huge marker. My daughter's handwriting was indecipherable. It had this really strange pattern, big letters, little letters. It was crazy. She now has the best handwriting in our family. It's almost calligraphic. It's so gorgeous. So point is that she started to gain function over her body, over her emotions, over her socialization, her interactions with others, but be it family or friends, that increase in her ability to interact with strangers, which is always a challenge in the spectrum disorder children, all started to improve. So we're like, this is magical. And I agreed and said, yes, it is magical, and this is something I want to be a part of.
A huge study came out a few years ago from UC Irvine, and they were taking a look at the best ways to treat ADD. And they looked at medications, and pharmacotherapy tends to work for about 3 years, and then you get the poop out effect. The medications, the stimulants just don't work as well, and people try to escalate the doses, but they just can't get the same response. So they were trying to look at what has better long-term effects on focus and concentration than just relying on these medications. And they actually found that mindfulness and relaxation had better effect. I wanted to call them up immediately and try to find who on earth was the person who was training these people with ADD how to do mindfulness, because I want his number, because all my patients need to see him. But the reality is, it's one of the #1 treatments, not only for attention issues, but for treating anxiety disorders and helping with mood too. So
neurofeedback works, you can think of any system or any organism is dependent upon feedback. One-celled creatures, amoeba, have feedback. They reach out to something, if it's either good or bad, and it makes in its own way. It doesn't even have a brain. It makes a decision organically to move forward or to retreat. Go all the way up to the higher animals like ourselves. We're making much more complicated decisions about what's interesting, not interesting, fear-making, what's appropriate response behavior in our system. So we're always dealing with feedback. Feedback is the nature of life. We couldn't exist without it. What neurofeedback does, well, is biofeedback. Some of you are familiar, if you ever had a mood ring, the first biofeedback device, it actually was measuring your skin temperature and would change the color of the stone in the mood ring. That's biofeedback. So you're getting a witness of something that's actually going on internally. You're getting a visible manifestation of it. There's heart rate variability training, there's skin conductivity, there's measuring sweat glands, there's all kinds of biofeedback. Neurofeedback is a subset of biofeedback in a sense, but we're using EEG signaling to present back as the feedback mechanism for understanding what's going on inside the brain. We're measuring amplitude. We put little tiny sensors on your head, very traditional stuff, been going on for 75, 80 years now. This is not anything that just happened yesterday. So the amplitude of the signal is interesting because we want to find out what those variations are. What is the pattern that's being observed here on the brain, by the brain, and how can it readjust to get a better pattern? So by providing feedback in whatever manner you choose to provide it, you're giving information to that organ, the brain, so that it can make best decision. How do I approach that? The brain is sitting in the dark. It's reading digital information coming from your ears or your eyes or whatever, so it isn't really interacting with reality as we perceive it. It's processing information. What we do in neurofeedback is give it specific, in the moment, targeted information on its function. What are you doing right now? Is that useful information for you or not? If it's not useful information, stop doing it. What we mean by that is what we present to the client is a change of pattern on a video screen, let's say. So there'll be some flickering of a screen will get bigger and smaller. It's very obvious to the person sitting in the chair what's happening, but more importantly, it's obvious to the brain. Oh my gosh, that's me. It recognizes over a period of time. That's why the training takes a while. And now let's characterize this, by the way, for anybody who's watching. It's not a therapy. It truly isn't. This is a training tool. This trains the brain in self-awareness and self-regulation. And the second being derived from the first. It has to become aware of its own signal, and then it will organically strategize a way to regulate, because that's its evolutionarily designed outcome. So we're presenting these variations in electrical signaling to the client sitting in the chair for their observation. Over a course of a few sessions, the brain finally recognizes, oh my goodness, that's me. The television isn't blowing up. That's actually my circuitry doing that. What do I need to do? What's the management I'm going to put in here so that'll stop? Because I'm spending energy. I don't want to every time, because it's a pattern. I have to discern it. I have to make a judgment about it. Tying into that, is it dangerous concept.
You know, there's a lot of new therapies out there that it can be really helpful for some people with brain disorders. In autism, we've been using, for some children, helminth therapy. Helminths are a worm that are parasites, but they're non-parasitic to humans. So that people will consume these helminths, and they impact their brain health. So for some children, the helminths will decrease the immune response in their body, will lower inflammation in their body, and they can have improvements in their symptoms. So that's kind of an interesting treatment that some people will benefit from, and really causes no harm to try. Well, another area we've been really excited about are looking for and detecting are these folate receptor antibodies. Multiple children, a very high percentage of kids on the autistic spectrum have antibodies against these folate receptors. Folate receptors are in your brain, and you need folate, which comes from your foliage, all your green leafy vegetables. You need folate to bind to these receptors for proper brain development to occur. And unfortunately, a lot of children with these folate receptor antibodies are having changes or decrease in brain development. When we check for folate receptor antibodies, we see a high percentage of children on the autistic spectrum with these antibodies. There are ways that we can treat that. We can treat that by giving higher doses of folate, and also by removing dairy from their diet, because dairy often will cause these folate receptor antibodies to occur. Sleep is absolutely underrated, especially in our current culture. Sleep is critical for brain health. Sleep deficiency has been seen time and time again within multiple studies to be linked with decreased cognition, lower mood disorders, having a harder time with memory and focus and attention. Sleep is really critical for our brain, and we need to focus on it all the time. As our children, as all of us are using more and more technology, unfortunately, that often leads to less and less sleep, and a lot of issues in terms of attention and focus and ADHD and memory problems.
We've seen a revolution in brain science in the last 20 years. We went from believing that the brain was fixed, that you had a certain number of brain cells at birth. If you damaged them, that was your tough luck, to now understanding that even at the moment of death, you are creating new brain cells and you are creating new connections at any age. And this revolutionized our view of what the brain is capable of. We know that these brain disorders are not fixed. This is one of the most powerful discoveries of the last 20 years, is that we can actually modify these, what we thought were fixed brain disorders like depression and autism and ADD, and even things like dementia and Parkinson's. The body has the capacity to repair, the brain has the capacity to repair and heal when the insults are taken away and the right ingredients are put in the system. So it's really a revolutionary time in brain science, and sadly, conventional medicine is just not caught up. We are now at Cleveland Clinic doing a research program looking at how we can impact early dementia by using all these approaches, dealing with the root causes, infections, toxins, diet, and then helping put in the right ingredients for health. And it's a very powerful model. And we're seeing people actually starting to reverse dementia and reverse common problems that we thought were not possible, like autism and ADD. So we have a very different way of thinking in functional medicine, which is actually looking at how the body affects the brain. And that is really a fundamental insight that I had once I started treating patients for their physical problems. Their mental problems got better, their ADD went away, their autism improved, their depression went away, their anxiety went away, their panic attacks went away. And I thought, wow, this is something that nobody's talking about, how our body affects our brain. And the first thing to do when you have mental illness, when you have ADD, when you have depression, dementia, any of these things, is to start to treat the foundation. There may be psychological issues, there may be trauma and stress, but those things are much easier to deal with once you've built the foundation of health. Up next, we'll talk about what many believe to be the leading cause of disability in America, depression. We'll also discuss anxiety, fears, and ways to optimize your brain health. See you there. I hope that this docuseries is giving you a deeper understanding of our most precious and dynamic organ, our brain. Having optimal brain health can transform your life. For me, my best brain meant that I could have more time with my family and friends, and I could pursue all of my dreams with a great sense of joy. I want that for you too. If you're finding the information in Broken Brain helpful, I would want you to consider owning this docuseries. When you purchase Broken Brain, you're fully covered with our no questions asked 90-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk to you. We've taken that risk onto ourselves so that you can just try it out and decide later whether it's a good fit for you or not.